lecture series for ethics. You'll recall that in our previous video we finished up Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics Book 1, and specifically we were looking at the issue of what is the role for Aristotle of external goods in achieving human happiness or eudaimonia. And what we saw is that Aristotle takes a sort of balanced view. Now you'll recall that external goods are opposed or distinguished from goods of the soul. So goods of the soul involve states of mind like pleasure, for instance, or also our character, right? So if you attain virtue and you have a good moral character, that's a good of the soul. If you experience pleasure, that's a good of the soul of a different sort. But external goods are goods which are outside of those things. So things like reputation or power or wealth or influence or children or friends. All of these are external goods. And so one of the things to notice about external goods, specifically as opposed to virtue or developing our character, is that Aristotle notes that external goods are outside of our control. So largely whether we become powerful and influential or wealthy or have a lot of friends or are healthy, there are things we can do, of course, to forward these aims, to try to achieve these goods. But largely speaking, these goods can be seen to be up to fortune or outside of our immediate control. We cannot ultimately be in charge or control whether we are successful in attaining those goods. And so the question is, does human happiness require some of those goods? Is our happiness to some extent outside of our control, or is it completely within our control? And the view that Aristotle comes up with, as we talked about, is that while virtue, a good of the soul, which we are in control of and we can build through our own effort and skill and training and developing habits, that is the primary component of our happiness. But he says we would never call someone happy who suffers horrible tragedies and misfortunes and doesn't have sufficient external goods to be effective in their endeavors. We would never call that person happy, even though those occurrences are not their responsibility. They're not under the control. So they are stricken with a horrible illness, something bad happens to a family member, something happens which gets rid of all their wealth and money. Even though these things are outside of our control, we still wouldn't say someone who suffers those tragedies and losses is happy. So for Aristotle, yes, there's a lot we can do to become happy through our own effort, but also a lot is left up to chance. Now, I want to further consider this position, and in order to do so, we're going to take a step away from Aristotle for a couple videos, and we're going to look at the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. And I had you look at two things. First, his short Enchiridion, which just means handbook. It's sort of you could think of it as initial handbook or sort of learner's manual for the Stoic philosophy. And then also a selection of one of Epictetus' much longer work called the Discourses. And in this video, we're going to see that the Stoics, and Epictetus in particular, reject Aristotle's view on external goods. While Aristotle says virtue is primary but external goods are still needed, Epictetus and the Stoics are going to say no, in fact, all that matters for our happiness is virtue, is living correctly. And what this means is that your happiness, if you are actually living the correct way, if you are actually living as a rational being should live, then your true happiness cannot be affected by anything beyond your control. And so whereas we see Aristotle take a more moderate view, we see Epictetus and the Stoics take a more extreme view. Okay, so before we get into exactly how Epictetus argues for this point, we should say a few things about his life because it is relevant to his philosophy. So Epictetus was a little bit later. He came after Aristotle, in fact. And he was born in 55 CE, so we're talking in the Common Era, whereas Aristotle, Plato, for instance, were before the Common Era. And one of the most important points about Epictetus' life that you need to know is that he initially came to Rome as a slave and lived as a slave for a long time, and while he was a slave, studied under a Stoic teacher. Now, both of these facts are important, right? It's important, of course, that he was exposed to Stoicism at a young age, you can certainly see how that would influence and affect the development of his own thinking, his own philosophy. But I think even more important is the fact that he was a slave for a significant portion of his young life. And you can imagine, for instance, if you're born in such a circumstance, as low and sort of unfortunate and horrible circumstances one might imagine, being literally a slave, you would of course have to be confronted with the task or challenge of finding out, well, how can I still live, to whatever extent I can, a happy life? And in fact, I think one of the main points that Epictetus wants to get across through his teaching, through his philosophy, is that no matter what sort of circumstance you're faced with, no matter how unfair, no matter how horrible, and no matter how tragic, there's a way that you can be happy, flourishing, and as we're going to see in this video, most importantly, even free. I think it's extremely notable that freedom plays such an important role in Epictetus' philosophy, and this came out of the reflections he was working on as he was a slave, as he was seemingly deprived of all freedom. And what we're going to see is Epictetus is going to claim that even while he was a slave, there was nothing that was truly stopping him from being free in the most important and most fundamental philosophical sense. And it's interesting, there's a story that was told about Epictetus while he was a slave that sort of gets at his mindset and where he's coming from. So the story goes, when still a slave, Epictetus was tortured by his master who twisted his leg. Enduring the pain with complete composure, Epictetus warned the person who was torturing him that this was going to break his leg. So he says, if you continue doing this, this will break my leg. And when it did break, he said, "There, did I not tell you it would break?" And from that time, Epictetus was lame. So this is certainly not the sort of behavior you would expect from someone who was literally being tortured to the point of having their leg broken. He very calmly, and you might say stoically, tells this individual that their action will cause his leg to break and accepts that it will happen and takes it in stride when it does happen. And if you've ever heard the term stoicism before doing this reading or encountering this class, it's sort of this attitude which it usually refers to. The person who is stoic is not overcome by emotion. The person who is stoic sort of accepts their circumstances and takes a sort of distant or remote view of what's going on, doesn't get caught up in the moment. And of course, in this very extreme circumstance, the story goes that Epictetus himself was able to do this very thing. Now, what does this show? Well, first, of course, that he had taken in the teachings of his Stoic teacher, and secondly, that he had engaged in some sort of process of training or habituation to enable him to act like this. Because certainly we would imagine no human being naturally could be so dismissive of pain, so dismissive of torture, that they could act this way. And so while Epictetus is going to give us a picture of life which seems very extreme, which seems almost unrealistic and maybe even inhuman, we have to remember that the expectation would of course not be that you could live with this sort of calm and distant and stoic disposition naturally or right away. In fact, the expectation is you would have to engage in a long train of training and mental exercises to be able to put yourself in that mindset. And in fact, if you read the entire discourses, for instance, it's a long conversation with various people who are challenging him on points of the Stoic philosophy, and him explaining the sort of mental process you would have to go to in order to achieve the Stoic frame of mind or point of view. Okay, so that's a little bit of background about Epictetus. Let's jump into the text itself. And I'm going to start with the Enchiridion, and we're going to give further context to it by also looking at the discourses. So as I said, Epictetus' main role, his major aim here, is to explain how we can be free and flourishing and happy even in the worst circumstances. And so the first thing we should want from Epictetus is, well, what does it mean to be free? What can we actually control in life? In the very first sentence of the Enchiridion, he says the following: there are things which are within our power, and there are things which are beyond our power. Within our power are opinion, aim, desire, aversion, and in one word, whatever affairs are our own. Beyond our power are body, property, reputation, office, and in one word, whatever are not properly our own affairs. So we have this split here between those things which are in our power and which are beyond our power. So let's start by considering the things that are beyond our power. Body, the health and strength of the body, how much property we own, wealth, reputation, what other people think of us, office, meaning what position you hold, whether a job or a position in government, or just sort of your place in society, your role in society, what activities you engage in. So we should all recognize these, of course, as, for Aristotle, they're external goods. And you'll see the Stoics actually refer to these things as externals. And again, you might look at this and say, the first question is, well, is it really true, for instance, that these externals are not within our fundamental control? Because you say, look, there are things I can do to make my body healthy and strong. There are things I can do to increase my wealth or have a good reputation or pursue a certain job opportunity I want. There are things I can do. And Epictetus wouldn't deny that. But what he would say is that to actually ensure that you achieve any of those goals, any of those aims, is always going to be dependent on something outside of yourself. So let's just take a simple example. Take the health and strength of the body. Okay, well, to have a healthy and strong body, you need to exercise, you need to have the right sort of food, you need to be able to get the right sort of rest. And those seem to be things that you can control. But then you think about it further. Of course, having healthy food to nourish your body requires that you have food. And again, you might say, well, look, I know I go to the grocery store and I depend on that as my source of food, but I can, go out and hunt and gather myself. Okay, well, that itself depends on there being animals to hunt or there being sufficient vegetables and fruits to gather and forage. Suppose you live in a desert. Suppose you live in an area where there isn't sufficient food. Suppose even if there is food around, it's just not enough to attain your goal of actually having a healthy and strong body. The mere fact that in our society we take it to be the case that everyone should strive, that it's a good goal for everyone to strive to have a healthy and strong body that will allow you to live a long life, depends on a wide variety of circumstances that depend on past and present events. We can only imagine that it's a realistic goal to have a healthy and strong body in a situation where we have the political and social organization and situation where food is available, where we have the time in our days to worry about selecting the right food, having time to exercise, etc., etc. Again, property and wealth, there are things you can do, of course, to make money, but no matter what it is, you're always going to be subject to fortune, right? I mean, the clearest example of this is putting your money in the stock market, which can sometimes seem like a lottery, but even if you have a stable job, you could be fired. That company could go under and it could have nothing to do with anything you did. As Aristotle explained, your reputation is largely a matter of what other people think about you, and you can't control other people's minds. So if you think about all these external goods, you can do things to pursue them, but you can't ever ensure that you'll actually be able to achieve or gain those external goods. It's always going to be dependent on some matter of luck, some matter of chance. You'll always be dependent on something else. So this is why he says they're beyond our power. Now on the other side, of course, we have what's within our power. He says opinion and aim, desire and aversion. So basically, these are actions of the mind, what we believe to be true, what our goals are, what we want, and what we want to avoid. So what he's going to say is that everything sort of material or about your reputation or any external good, not within your control, but you do have a sphere under which you are in complete control. And that sphere includes what you believe and what you want, most fundamentally. He's going to say no one can make you believe what's false. And no one can make you desire what you shouldn't desire. And now, so this is already going to give us a bit of a hint at what freedom for Epictetus is going to look like. Freedom for Epictetus is not going to be about making sure you get the right external goods you want, but it's going to be about making sure that you believe and desire the right things. Okay, so we get some indication here. Now, That's the first sentence of the Enchiridion, and he goes on to tell us why is there this connection between pursuing what's within our power and freedom. And notice how he describes this point. He says, now the things that are within our power, the actions of the mind, are by nature free, unrestricted, unhindered, but those beyond our power are weak, dependent, restricted, and alien. If you take for your own only that which is your own and view what belongs to others just as it really is, then no one will ever compel you, no one will restrict you. So there are some important points here. For him, freedom is going to be about what we focus on. If we focus about what's within our control, then we'll be free and unhindered. But if we focus on what's beyond our control, if we get wrapped up in things that are dependent on others or subject to chance and fortune, then we're going to be weak, dependent. And he says even that these things are alien to us. So this might be a sort of a weird thing to think, because you might be, you're in school now, you say, well, why do I want to get a degree? I want to graduate to get my degree in order to pursue a certain career path. And in fact, your pursuit of that certain career path might very much be a part of your identity. You might be saying, this is my primary goal right now, to pursue this career path, to get all the gains and rewards and benefits it will bring me. And if it's very much your focus, it would be weird for Epictetus to come to you and say, that goal of yours of pursuing that career path, of getting that job, that's something alien to you. That's something foreign. Because if it's something you really care about, it probably wouldn't feel like that at all. It would probably feel like the most important thing, or something at least that's very important in constituting your identity. But one of the things he wants to say here is this is a sort of illusion. Society and human nature in general has a way of making us think that things which aren't in our control, right? Body, reputation, office, property, things that aren't with our control are an important part of us, right? You see people get wrapped up in their wealth, you see people get wrapped up in their job, or in their health or strength, or in their bodies more generally. You see people get wrapped up in all these things, and Epictetus is going to say this is in fact the very first step to living an unfree and in fact unhappy life. The very first step is pretending that these things you can't control are actually within your control. And the reason we live lives where we feel weak, where we feel powerless, where we feel our lives are out of control, is simply because we're investing so much of ourselves in those things that are beyond our power. So what should we do? Well, he tells us in the other part of this passage I read that instead of conceiving of those things as pursuits that you need to go after, things you need to achieve, things that are a part of your identity, you should instead say that belongs to someone else. Right? So say there's a certain job you want and you get the interview, and at the end of the day, you thought you did well, but they give the job to someone else. You say, well, did that job ever really belong to me? Was it ever really in the cards for me to get it? Apparently not. The way the world went, the way the events went, that job was for someone else. And look, it was never within my control anyway. The only thing that's in my control is what I believe and what I desire, but I can't control external things. So again, he says, only take that which is your own as your own, and view what belongs to others just as what it really is. And you'll never feel compelled, you'll never feel restricted. Okay, so we can gain some further clarification about this if we look at the discourses now, and specifically this section of the discourses which I had you read, which is about freedom. And he gives a really nice summary of the point he's trying to make here in the Enchiridion. And I'm going to call this the Stoic principle of freedom. He says, he who is free lives as he wishes to live, who is neither subject to compulsion, nor to hindrance, nor to force, whose movements to action are not impeded, whose desires attain their purpose, and who does not fall into that which he would avoid. So this is the main point. To be free is to live as you would wish to live. And so I'll explain this, I'll call this the Stoic principle of freedom. A person is free only if she acts in the way she wants to act or desires to act, and does not act in the way she desires to avoid acting. Okay, so we might wonder here, why connect freedom and desire in this way? Why should we see freedom as fundamentally a matter of what you want or what you don't want to have happen to you? Okay, well, let's think about this. Imagine, for instance, that what you want to do most is you want to be able to fly. And when I say you want to be able to fly, I don't mean you want to get on an airplane or you want to buy an airplane or anything like that, or even go hang gliding. I mean, you look at the birds in the sky, you see them soaring around, and the thing you want most is that you want to be able to fly like the birds. Now, it's sort of a ridiculous example in a sense, but it actually is quite analogous to the point that Epictetus is making about our lives generally. So because you want to fly about like the birds, you run around, you run as fast as you can, and you start flapping your wings, hoping that your arms will be able to take you into the air. Now, of course, you would be doomed to failure. And what I've asked you is this person free? Are they living a free life? Now, on the one hand, you might say, sure, they're living a free life because there's no one out there that's stopping them from doing what you're doing, right? You're in the middle of a field trying to fly like a bird, and it seems a little ridiculous. But, hey, I mean, there's no one stopping you. The government's not telling you can't do it. You're just out in the field doing what you want to do. But on the other hand, it doesn't quite seem like this person is free. Even though no one's forcing them to do anything or preventing them from doing anything, they're pursuing an end which is fundamentally doomed to failure. And imagine, for instance, if this was really part of your identity, if this is something that was so important to you to be able to fly like a bird, how in fact would you feel when you tried and tried and tried and ultimately ran up against the fact that it just wasn't possible? Well, you might feel like your life was out of control. You might feel weak. You might feel powerless. And there's another way of thinking about freedom. Freedom might not just be, well, no one's stopping me from doing what I want. It might be, do you actually have the power to do what you want? Do you have the ability to fulfill the desires you have? And this person doesn't. They just seem misguided. They seem fundamentally powerless to achieve what they most want. And the reason I bring this up is because it gets at the difference between two different sorts of freedom. So on the one hand, there's a kind of freedom which is freedom from external compulsion or coercion, right? So if someone, at gunpoint demands you do something, if the government says that you can't park here or we're going to give you a ticket or you can't do these actions or you go to jail, you'll say, I'm under compulsion or I'm under constraint. There's someone stopping me from doing something. If you want to go into a room and someone locks the door, you're being constrained from going into that room. So that's one sort of freedom, not to be under those constraints. But for Epictetus, remember, that's not the most fundamental kind of freedom, because he lived as a slave. So he was extremely unfree from the point of constraint, literally owned by another human being. But he said, even in that circumstance, you can still attain a higher sort of freedom. And for him, this is the freedom of not having unfulfilled desires. Or we might say, freedom from unfulfilled desires. It's the freedom of achieving your desires, achieving your goals. And we're going to see how Epictetus recommends that we go about doing that. But first, let's see just how he rejects this idea that freedom from constraint is what's most important. So this is from the Discourses also. He says, the slave wishes to be set immediately free. Why? Now, of course, you can imagine, given his personal history, this is probably a question that he asked himself or a thought he had. It's like, I really wish I would be set free. So then he says, well, why do you want to be set free? Why do you want these constraints to come off of you? Do you think that he wishes to pay money to the collectors of 20ths? No. But because he imagines that hitherto, through not having obtained this, he is hindered and unfortunate. If I shall be set free, immediately it is all happiness, this person imagines. I care for no man, I speak to all as an equal, and like to them, I go where I choose, I come from any place I choose, and go where I choose. So the person he's imagining who's a slave says to themselves, if I only were set free, I could go and do what I want, I could talk to who I want, I could be seen as an equal to everyone else, and this would be great. But then reality hits. Epictetus imagines then this person is set free, and forthwith, having no place where he can eat, he looks for some man to flatter. So as soon as he's released, he says, oh, I need food. Well, I don't have any food. How am I going to do that? Well, I need to please or flatter someone. Or you might even say, go work for someone to get money so I can get food. Now, doesn't that put you in a relationship of dependence on that person? Aren't you now dependent on that job to get the things that you need to survive? And so then he either works with his body and endures the most dreadful things, and if he can obtain a manager, he falls into a slavery much worse than his former slavery. So the point he's making here is simply that there is never escape from compulsion, coercion, or constraint. No matter whether you're a slave or whether you sort of occupy the highest ranks and rungs of society, there's never a position in your life where you're going to be able to be completely free of chance or luck, completely able to control your own destiny. Nobody has that freedom. So, if nobody has that freedom, then maybe what's more important is what I'm calling the freedom from unfulfilled desires. So Epictetus explains it in this way. He says, is it possible that he who desires any of the things which depend on others can be free from hindrance? No. Is it possible for him to be unimpeded? No. Therefore, he cannot be free. So, remember, this sort of freedom is one in which the things I want I'm able to achieve. And you might say, well, how do I go about doing that? How do I make sure I can achieve and get the things I want? On the one hand, you might say, well, I'll just increase my power. Right? Because if I'm powerful enough, then I'm able to achieve the things I want, whether it be wealth or a job or the health of my body, etc., etc. Now, but for Epictetus, as we've already seen, that's not going to work because nobody is free from chance or fortune. Everyone is subject to some amount of luck. So if that's not going to work, if we can't fulfill our desires by making ourselves more powerful, we can't ensure all our desires are fulfilled by increasing our power and ability, what can we do? Well, Epictetus is going to say what we should do is restrict and lessen our desires to something that's more realistic. And notice how sort of extreme this gets as he continues. Consider then whether we have nothing which is in our own power only, or whether we have all things. What do you mean? When you wish the body to be entire, is it in your power or not? It's not in my power. So when you wish to have a healthy and strong body entirely, can you control that? No. When you wish to be healthy, this is not in my power. When you wish to be handsome, nor is this. Life or death, neither is this in my power. Your body then is another, subject to every man who is stronger than yourself. It is. But your estate, is it in your power? And to have it when you please, as long as you please, as such as you please? No. Right? So are your good looks, is your body, is your estate and your wealth in your power? No. Of course, disease can ravage your body. People who are stronger than you can steal your wealth and estate. So the idea is to not focus on desiring those things. The point is not to desire a handsome, healthy, strong body, or to be extremely wealthy, or to have a ton of friends. The point is not to desire those things, because you can't control them. The point, rather, is to just limit your desires to what you can control. And as we already saw, what you can control is what your beliefs and desires themselves are. And so this is why he sees assent or belief or opinion as a realm of life in which no one can control you. And he makes this point in this passage from the Discourses as well. Look at the thing then, thus examine it. Is any man able to make you assent to that which is false? No man. In the matter of assent then, you are free from hindrance and obstruction. Granted. Well, wait a minute. A man can force you to desire to move toward that to which you don't choose. So he says, well, look, yes, we'll say that I can control what I believe, I can control what I want. But can't someone by a threat of force, with a gun to my head, force me to do things I don't want to do? Well, maybe, but Epictetus says, He can, for when he threatens me with death or bonds, he compels me and desire to move toward it. If then you despise death and bonds, do you still pay any regard to him? No. Is then the despising of death an act of your own, or is it not yours? It is my act. So suppose someone threatens you with force to get you to do something you don't want to do, to hand over your wallet, for instance. You might say, well, look, this is out of my control. I'm being controlled by something external, because what am I going to do? Not give them the wallet and then succumb to the threat of force and die? Well, Epictetus says, well, look, who's responsible for you putting so much value on your life? Or, as he puts it, despising death. Isn't that one of your beliefs? Isn't that one of your desires or things that you're averse to? It's a mental act. So Epictetus is going to say, because it's a mental act, you despising death and valuing life in the way you do, that's the reason that threat could work. If you didn't care whether you lived or died in that moment, if that was not important, if you said, well, it's out of my control, then there's nothing anyone could do to control you. So instead of focusing on our power to attain external goods, Epictetus says that instead we should just focus on the actions of the mind, believing the right things and desiring the right things. And with these points in place, what we see is that Epictetus gives the following argument for why we should not desire external goods. I'm going to call this the argument from freedom, because basically how Epictetus is arguing, and it's my outline, basically the argument he largely makes in the first section of the Enchiridion. It's basically an argument. He says, well, given what we've said about freedom, there's no reason to desire external goods. And it gives a good recap of the points we made here. So premise 1, the Stoic principle of freedom. Some person is free only if she acts in the way she desires to act. It does not act in the way she desires to avoid acting. Now, P2, one can only act in the way she desires and not act in the way she desires to avoid acting if she desires what's under our control. So we can only be free in the sense that Epictetus is talking about if our desires are completely under our control. P3, no external goods like wealth, health, power, honor, or pleasure are under our control. Therefore, the first conclusion is nobody who desires external goods is free. And this is, to some extent, a calming thing. If you want to be free, it at least shows a path forward to where instead of trying and failing to achieve these things beyond my control, I can simply attempt to not desire them or lessen their value. Now you combine this with the fourth premise that everyone should aim to be free, and in the Enchiridion we see that Epictetus does think we should want to be free, because he says if we don't do the right things, you will certainly fail of that by which alone happiness and freedom are procured. So he certainly puts together or thinks that happiness and freedom are very closely connected. And if that is the case, then the final conclusion we get, if nobody who desires external goods is free and everyone should aim to be free, then the conclusion is nobody should desire external goods. And he describes this conclusion of the following: seek at once, therefore, to be able to say to every unpleasing semblance, you are but a semblance and by no means the real thing. If it concerns anything beyond our power, be prepared to say it's nothing to you. And think about how powerful this is. As a mental exercise, think about how powerful it is every time something doesn't go your way, every time something that you want to achieve, you fail to grasp, every time something unfortunate happens, whether just a small day-to-day instance of it, right? We all have times to go through our day with these minor annoyances, which we realize cause us way more mental anxiety and way more mental trouble than they're really worth. So everything from small annoyances like that to great tragedies in your life, this Stoic strategy, in Epictetus' view, will allow you to live freely. You simply have to say, this is not a real disaster for me. This is not a real harm to me. It's just an unpleasing semblance. It only feels or appears like it's bad to me because I have so much of my identity wrapped up in getting this job or having this person like me or gaining wealth, or not being sick, or whatever. But if you simply say to yourself, this is just an unpleasing semblance and it's not the real thing, none of those things can control you, none of those things can significantly harm your life. Okay, so I will conclude there. We will pick up with Epictetus in the next video. Thank you for listening, and I will see you then.